I think we still have a few people joining. I think we still have a few people joining, so we'll get started in a few minutes. I guess we can go ahead and get going. Hi, I'm Bailey Poyam from the UofL Office of Research and Innovation. Thank you so much for joining us today. As you know, we purchased an institutional license to Orcid to help UofL researchers track and manage their research and scholarship impact. Eventually, Orcid will make it so much easier to streamline faculty productivity reporting at UofL and generally make everyone's lives a whole heck of a lot easier. I'd like to introduce Sheila Rabin, who is program leader for persistent identifier communities at Orcid. She's here today to talk a bit about Orcid and how to get started and how it benefits you. So without further ado, Sheila, you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you, Bailey, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Before we dive in, I just wanted to cover a few logistics for the session today. We do ask that if you have any questions that come up throughout the presentation, please just use the chat box to send us those questions and we'll do a Q&A at the end of the session. And just note that your microphone and video have been disabled for this session. So again, just use the chat box. Also, we have enabled Zoom's live auto transcription for subtitles, which you might be seeing on your screen already. And within the Zoom controls, you can either hide those subtitles or have them show. That's really up to you, but that is a feature that's available. And last but not least, we are recording this session today. So the recording will be made available to everyone if you want to go back and watch it again, or if you have to leave early, just know that we are recording this. So again, thanks for joining. My name is Sheila Rabin, and I'm the program leader for our Orcid US community. And as Bailey mentioned, University of Louisville is one of our Orcid members. So whether you are already familiar with Orcid, or even if you've never heard of Orcid, it's basically an increasingly important factor of your digital identity and impact as a researcher. So I'm really glad that you came to this session today. Before we get started though, I do have a quick couple of poll questions for you. So you should see a poll on the screen asking whether or not you've heard of Orcid before this session, just so I can get an idea of how familiar people are with Orcid prior to joining this session. So far, it looks like the people who have answered have all heard of Orcid, so that is great. Okay. And then I have one more poll, which is let's see, stop share, which is, do you already have an Orcid ID? So if you could also answer this question, that will be helpful for me. Okay, great. It looks like several people do already have an Orcid ID, but we have some people who don't yet. So that's great, because today we are going to cover, let's see, we're going to talk about what Orcid is. We're going to talk about the Orcid ID and the Orcid record, how Orcid can benefit you. If you don't already have an Orcid ID, we'll briefly cover how to get it. It's very easy. And then we'll cover some tips and tricks for populating your Orcid record with relevant information so that you can really get the most value from it. And then at the end, our colleague Wei Ling will cover where to go to get help on Orcid at UofL. So first and foremost, what is Orcid? Orcid stands for the Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier. And the goal of Orcid is to uniquely identify you so that you can get credit and attribution for your work and streamline your digital identity so that you can save time on administrative tasks while also keeping track of all of your affiliations and contributions in one central place. Orcid is a nonprofit, community-driven organization that serves the entire global research community. So Orcid provides researchers with what we call an Orcid ID, which is a 16-digit number that is unique to you so that you can distinguish yourself from other researchers despite any complexities that come with identifying ourselves by name alone. So anyone can get their own Orcid ID for free, and it looks something like this. This Orcid ID belongs to our volunteer researcher today, Sofia Maria Hernandez Garcia. And you'll notice that the Orcid ID looks like a link, and that's because it is. Your Orcid ID links to what we call an Orcid record. So if we were to click on Sophia's Orcid ID, we're taken to Sophia's Orcid record, which is populated with information about her, similar to what you might see on a CV or resume. Her employment information is there. We can see her education background. On the left side of the Orcid record, we can see that she has some other name variations listed that she has used, websites and social links, her country, other IDs that she might have in other platforms, for example. And if we scroll down, we can see that she also has her memberships and services listed, funding that she's received, research resources that she's used, and last but not least, works that she has produced, whether they're publications or data sets, basically any type of work or output can be included in this works section of the Orcid record. So that's a basic overview of what the Orcid ID is and the Orcid record. But now let's talk about the benefits of Orcid, because this is really one of the most important pieces, is understanding why this is important and how it will benefit you. So basically, Orcid distinguishes you from others, and your Orcid ID is designed to persist over time, even if your name changes or if anything else in your life changes. If you move from one institution to another, your Orcid ID will stay the same. And your Orcid record can really bolster your digital identity. And ultimately, your Orcid record can save you time when you have to fill out forms that ask for information about you and your research activities. And we'll cover each of these points a little bit more in depth. This is just an overview. And last but not least, I want to point out that many publishers and grant funders are starting to require Orcid IDs from authors and investigators. And so if you have not already run into this, it's likely that you will at some point in the future. And so again, having an Orcid ID will ensure that you're meeting these requirements when it is required by a publisher or by a funder. So just to elaborate on this point a little bit more, you know, depending on what journals you're publishing in, you may or may not be asked for your Orcid ID. That's really just so that various authors can be distinguished from each other and we know who's who, even if two people have the same name. And then funders, especially in the health sciences, are starting to ask for Orcid IDs as well, not only to distinguish between researchers, but also to kind of help get an idea of the impact of funding. And so having an Orcid ID can help funders see what publications have come out of that funding, maybe what subsequent funding somebody has received. And just to give you a heads up, just this year, the White House Office of Science and Technical Policy is going to be requiring that all federal funding agencies have to have policies that require investigators to have a digital persistent identifier for themselves. And so that basically means an Orcid ID. So just a little heads up there that these requirements, if you haven't already run into them, it's likely that you will in the future. So it's good that you're getting a head start learning about your Orcid ID and Orcid record now. So back to that basic factor of the Orcid ID distinguishing you from others and ensuring that your research outputs and activities are correctly attributed to you. This is especially helpful when you are publishing and working with other people. So for example, in this PubMed abstract that you're seeing on the screen, there are not only multiple authors, but multiple authors with the same last name and the same first initial. So just looking at these names, it's really impossible to distinguish who is who these researchers are, where they're coming from. These are really just names on a page with no additional context or identifying information. But when Orcid is used, it's much easier to distinguish between individuals and get more context around the researchers involved, which can also improve recognition and discoverability for you and your research outputs. So for example, this is a screenshot from a data sharing platform called Zenodo. And you can see that several of the names listed here have this little green ID icon. And that is because they have submitted their Orcid ID when they uploaded their paper or their data. And so for those that do have the icon, we can actually click on it and be taken to their Orcid record so we can learn more about who these people are. So for an example, we will click on this first author, Juan M. Banda. We'll click on that Orcid ID icon and we're taken to this person's Orcid record. And here we can see they have their employment information, their education and qualifications, past works that they've put out, as well as links to their Twitter and other platforms. So this lends some additional context and credibility to this author and distinguishes them from others. So again, if we were to just see this person's name, we wouldn't have this context around who this person is and where they're coming from. So Orcid really helps to distinguish individuals and create a digital presence or a digital identity for researchers and their activities. And Orcid is also helpful because of names. Names can be very tricky. If there are other people who share your name, let's say you have a really common name like Jane Smith, even I have searched my own name in Google and there are other people named Sheila Rabin out there. So even if it's not a common name like Jane Smith, there might be other people with your same name. Or if your name has changed over time, people's names can change for a variety of reasons. So Orcid can help tie all of your works together, even if your name has changed. And in the third scenario, let's say you've used different variations of your name in the past. Maybe, for example, with our volunteer researcher, Sophia, She's published under Sophia Garcia, but also SM Garcia, Sophia M. Garcia. So if you've used different variations of your name in the past like that, Orcid can really come in handy there too. So coming back to Sophia, again, with all of these different name variations or ways that she has or could have written her name, submitted her name to grants and papers and other outputs, it's kind of impossible to know just looking at these names if it's all the same person or if these are each a different person. Similarly, if we're looking for an author named Sophia Garcia, there may be multiple people who identify with that name. But again, with Orcid, because Sophia's Orcid ID is unique, we can better distinguish her works and activities from other individuals. So Orcid really helps to streamline that online digital identity across the research landscape. And when you think about the very basic aspects of the activities that a researcher is involved in, you get a job somewhere, you're working with an employer, you apply for some funding and get funding to do specific research, and then you publish the output of that research. And often you are required to report your activities back to your employer and report your activities back to any funding organizations. And while this diagram is very simplistic, we know that things can get increasingly complex as you continue to work with more and more organizations over time. And so when you have an Orcid ID and have your information populated in your Orcid record, Orcid really helps to streamline this process of working with organizations, reporting back to organizations, and that helps you as a researcher kind of save time, but also it helps the organizations that you're working with. So Orcid is used by funders, publishers, research institutions all across the globe to uniquely identify the researchers that they work with and to make any application and reporting requirements easier for researchers. So in this graphic, you can see the researcher at the center with their Orcid ID and their Orcid record. And then all of the organizations that the researcher works with are basically able to connect with the researcher through their Orcid ID to then get information about the researcher directly from their Orcid record. But also they can add relevant information to the Orcid record on behalf of the researcher. So that again saves time. And the idea is that you and or the organizations that you're affiliated with can populate your information in your Orcid record once, and then you can reuse that information from your Orcid record whenever you have to provide it to other organizations. A really good example of this is a platform called Science CV. Some of you may have heard of that, may be familiar with that. Basically, Science CV is a tool that is used by the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, because when you are applying for funding from one of those agencies, they provide Science CV as a tool to help you meet their BioSketch requirements. So with Science CV, if you have all of your information populated in your Orcid record, you can actually just transfer that data to Science CV by clicking a button, rather than having to sit there and manually retype all of your information into Science CV. And so this saves a lot of time. With Science CV, for example, Orcid is presented as an option to log in. So you can log into your Science CV account using your Orcid credentials. And this is a screenshot here, just showing one example of how you can select Orcid as a source to basically import information directly. So this is showing a list of publications from my Orcid record, and I can click the checkbox to indicate which items from my Orcid record I want to just be imported into Science CV. And so this is just one example. There are a number of different systems. Increasingly, there are more and more systems that are integrated with Orcid in this way to allow you to very easily transfer information from your Orcid record to a certain platform, so that you can basically save time and you don't have to waste time retyping all of your information manually. I also want to point out that right now, Orcid is currently the most used identifier across the globe for asserting online identity. And as we all know, things are happening online as opposed to in person more than ever now. And so the chart that you're seeing on this screen illustrates that about 70% of researchers across various disciplines are using Orcid ID to identify themselves. And the little blue box represents Orcid. So there are some other identifiers out there, but Orcid is by far the most widely used. I think because it is very interoperable and nonprofit and community driven. So Orcid is not tied to any one platform or company. It really is designed to be used in a variety of different contexts and situations. These figures are coming from a recent study that was done by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And basically, they did a survey in 2018 that was conducted with 12,000 authors working in a variety of disciplines across 60 countries. And this study also found that having a persistent, trusted digital identity can play a role in the way that researchers and their output are evaluated, which is increasingly important as we look to kind of speed up research and information sharing to support global challenges like what we've seen around COVID-19. And when research is shared, we often look at, who the authors are, who was involved in that research to determine the trustworthiness of that information. Of course, you can always Google somebody to look people up, but as we've already seen, a name alone can be somewhat unreliable. So Orcid provides that trusted, persistent way to identify researchers. And also the study found that researchers using digital tools and digital identity more extensively tend to leverage other tools like project management and cloud services more and engage in more activities that can result in broader impact, including patents, business management activity, provision of research services, and consultancy work. So essentially that boils down to stronger digital identity really leads to more research-related engagement. And in terms of open data and open research, Orcid comes into play because instead of having researcher information and contributions kind of spread out all over the web, Orcid provides a central place for everyone to store and access information about researchers and their research, and to make sure that individuals are actually linked to their contributions. And so this makes research and information about researchers more findable. And when those research contributions are more findable and linked to the individuals involved and centrally located in that Orcid record, the data and deliverables can be more easily shared and reused. Researchers can more easily find each other and make connections. And of course, researchers can more easily get recognition for their work. And the image that you're seeing here is the author list for, I think it was maybe a few years ago now when the first image of a black hole was released. And you can see that the majority of these authors have that Orcid ID icon. And so we could learn more about all of these people by clicking on their Orcid icon there. And just a little side note here, in terms of helping researchers get credit and recognition for their work, in addition to the Orcid ID itself, there are some other platforms that are building upon the Orcid ID and Orcid information to help researchers get that recognition. And so what you're seeing here is a platform called ResCognito, and it's basically built off of Orcid IDs and Orcid data. So anyone with an Orcid ID can recognize anyone else who has an Orcid ID for various types of contributions related to good research citizenship. So things like contribution to open research, sharing negative results, mentoring, positive public impact, and more. So this is an example of a ResCognito ledger for my colleague Richard Wynn. And you can see that his Orcid ID is linked here. And I have recognized him for public outreach and education. And you can also see that other individuals have recognized him, and even an organization has recognized him for presenting at a conference. And so there's also a visualization element here where you can see all of the people and organizations that have recognized Richard in this graph, including myself. So my name is on here, and if I were to hover over my own name on Richard's graph, I can see where we actually have shared connections. So it's pretty cool, and this is Rescognito is a relatively new tool that just came out within the last couple of years, but this is just an example of the types of things that you could subsequently do with Orcid, and we're expecting to see development of more of these types of tools that are designed to use Orcid IDs and data from Orcid records to help researchers make connections, connect to others, and get recognition for their work. So here's the part where if you don't have an Orcid ID yet, we're going to cover this very briefly. It takes about 30 seconds to get one, and it's free. So if you don't have an Orcid ID yet, or if you don't remember whether or not you have an Orcid ID, that's totally fine. Just go to orcid.org/register. And on the initial screen, you'll input just your first and last name and an email address. And you'll see that there are options to add more than one email address. And we do recommend that you do add more than one email address so that if you lose access to one email account, you can still access your Orcid account. So for example, I would recommend using your Louisville email address. And then if you have like a Gmail address or some other personal account, I would use both of those for that registration. Next, you just set your password for your Orcid account, and there's also a notification settings that you can select if you want to receive notifications or not. And finally, you're going to set your default data visibility settings. We're going to talk more about this in just a minute, but essentially you can choose how visible you want the information on your Orcid record to be, whether you want it to be publicly visible, only available to trusted organizations, or completely private. So you have full control over that visibility of the information in your Orcid record. Also, you'll be asked to agree to Orcid's terms of use and confirm that you're not a robot. And once you've done those things, you can register for your Orcid record. And once you do register, you will receive a confirmation email from Orcid that you'll need to click on to confirm your account in order to start adding information. Now, if you try to register for an Orcid ID, but you already have one, Orcid will alert you if there is already an Orcid ID associated with the email address or email addresses that you've tried to use to register. So on this screen, you'll see I'm trying to register for an Orcid ID, and they're saying, this email already exists in our system. Would you like to sign in? And so, you know, if you forgot that you had an Orcid ID and you actually do have one and you maybe forgot your password, there is the typical password reset workflow that you can go through. And also just know that if you do accidentally register for an Orcid ID, but it turns out that you already had one that was maybe under a different email address, Orcid does have a process for essentially you would choose one of the Orcid IDs and the other one would be deprecated so that you only have one account. So just keep in mind the goal behind Orcid is that each person only has one number that you use to distinguish yourself. Now, once you have registered for your Orcid ID, or if you already have one, you can then log into your Orcid record at orcid.org/login. And now we're going to talk about adding some information to your Orcid record, because registering for your Orcid ID is really just the first step. In order to really benefit and save time with Orcid, you do need to make sure that you have at least some information populated in your Orcid record. And the more information you have there, the better it will serve you. So again, one important thing to note before we get started, as I mentioned earlier, you do have full control over the data in your Orcid record, as well as your privacy and the visibility of your data. So you already set default visibility settings for your Orcid record when you registered. Now, when you're logged into your ORCID record, you can control the visibility settings for each piece of data in your ORCID record as highlighted here. So there are 3 different settings you can choose from. The first is everyone. This means that the data will be public and anyone on the internet will be able to see that information on your ORCID record. There's also the option to make your information completely private using the Only Me setting, which means that the information will only be visible to you and no one else. And finally, you can choose the Trusted Parties option, which means that only individuals that you designate or organizations that you connect your ORCID ID with will be able to see that information. And so with these visibility settings in mind, let's get started with some tips and tricks for populating information in your ORCID record. Now, adding information to your ORCID record is pretty straightforward. Just remember that the more information you have there, the more it will serve to distinguish you, and the more you can save time when you're interacting with any ORCID-enabled reporting systems. So ORCID does provide a space for you to provide your biographical information, employment, education and qualifications, invited positions and distinctions, memberships and service, funding, works. There's also an option for peer review activity and any research resources that you've used. You can't add those to your ORCID record yourself, but any organizations that are working with ORCID will be able to add that information for you. Now, the works section, we're going to start with that because it tends to be kind of the most complex, and it's one of the areas where people are most interested in having their past works visible on their ORCID record. So the works section is towards the bottom, and if you were to click on the Add Works button, you'll see a drop-down menu with a couple of different options for adding works to ORCID. I want to point out this search and link option because this can really save you time. So if you click on that search and link, you will see a list of databases that are connected with ORCID. And for each of these, basically you can click on them and go in and search for your works there and claim your works to your ORCID record. And that kind of helps you save time. I want to point out that if you have any works that have a DOI or a digital object identifier, many journals use DOIs for articles. You'll want to especially connect with Crossref, Metadata Search, and DataCite, because for these two, anytime you publish something or create an output that gets a DOI assigned to it, if your ORCID ID is included in the publication metadata when you submit your publication, that publication can be automatically added to your ORCID record for you in the future. So you don't even have to think about adding future works. So definitely connect with these, but I also encourage you to look at the other ones. They all pretty much work the same. So I'm going to use Crossref Metadata Search as our example. So when we click on Crossref Metadata Search, you'll see a screen where you're asked to authorize access for Crossref Metadata Search to interact with your ORCID record. You'll want to authorize that access because this is what will allow Crossref to be able to add publications to your ORCID record for you in the future. When you click that authorize access, you'll be taken to a screen where you can basically search for your name. And when you click the search, a bunch of works will come up that match the search terms. Ideally, you'll be able to find your publications very quickly. If you can't, though, I recommend using the search limitations on the left side to kind of limit your search so that you can find your works. But when you do find a work that belongs to you, you would just click this Add to ORCID button, at which point the screen will tell you that this is now in your ORCID record. And then you can go back to your ORCID record and you can see that this work has been added via Crossref Metadata Search. So I did not have to spend time typing this information in. I was able to search Crossref, find my works, and have them added for me. So this is a really great tip for when you're adding works to your ORCID record. One other tip that I'll mention very briefly, of course, you can always add works manually if you can't find them in your search and link, but there is an option to import Bib Text. So if you have works in, for example, Google Scholar or Zotero, for example, you can export your works in a format called Bib Text, and then Orcid allows you to import that Bib Text file in order to get your works populated there. And at the same time, any works that are already in your Orcid record, you can export to Bib Text if you need to get them into a different platform. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're adding works as well. Now for the funding section of your Orcid record, same basic thing. If you go to add funding, you'll see that you can either add it manually or there's a search and link option. With funding though, there's only one search and link database, which is Dimensions Wizard. And so if you click on Dimensions Wizard, this is basically a database of a lot of different funding sources where you can search for grants that you've received and have them added to your Orcid record for you. So same basic process, you're going to authorize access for Dimensions Wizard to be able to add information to your Orcid record for you. You can either search for grants using your first and last name, or you can search using the title of the grant. When you find one or more that belong to you, you'll use the checkbox to indicate that those are yours. Then you need to scroll all the way down to the bottom and click Next. And then it will ask you to just double check that these are the items you want added to your Orcid record, and you click Submit to Orcid. And then you can go back to your Orcid record and you can see that that funding has been added via Dimensions Wizard. So that's another way to save time. Of course, you can always add information manually here. Now, when it comes to adding employment and other affiliations, a little tip I want to share with you is that when you click, for example, add employment, and you start typing University of Louisville, you'll see that a drop-down menu appears where you can select University of Louisville from the drop-down menu there. I recommend doing that because that will pre-populate some of the organization information for you and just make you easier to find in terms of being affiliated with University of Louisville, and it helps you avoid typos and misspellings in the name of your organization. And the same thing is true for the education section and all of the other kind of affiliation sections of the Orcid record. Just start typing in the name of your organization and select it from the drop-down. And so again, just remember that the more information you can include in your Orcid record, the more it can benefit you. If you don't have time to add it all right now, you know, you can add a little bit and just come back to it periodically. I treat mine like I'm updating my CV. Every so often, I just go in and make sure that my Orcid record is up to date. And so, you know, you can also have an assistant help you if you have a research assistant or somebody that you trust. There is a trusted individuals option within Orcid. So if your assistant or whoever you trust also has an Orcid ID, you can give them access to edit your Orcid record for you. And so to do that, there's an account settings tab in your Orcid record. If you go to that account settings, you'll see a section called Trusted Individuals where you can search for the person and add them as a trusted individual. And then of course, with trusted organizations, those are basically any organizations that you have clicked that authorize access button. So the organization basically has to ask you for permission to add information to your Orcid record for you. So that screen that we saw when we connected with Crossref and Dimensions, where you're authorizing access, any organization that is asking you to be a trusted organization on your Orcid record, you'll have to go through that same authorized access process. And again, in the account settings, any organizations that you have authorized will appear under the trusted organizations section. You'll see the name of the organization, the date that you approved them, the type of access they have, and then the little trash can you can always click on to basically revoke that trusted status of any organization in the future. And when an organization does add information to your Orcid record, it will look something like this, where the source of that data will be the name of the organization. And these are just a few examples from around the globe. So aside from that, I mean, once you have your Orcid ID and data in your Orcid record, you can include your Orcid ID, for example, in your email signature, when you publish, and just anywhere else that makes sense in terms of providing a quick, easy way for people to get context around you and your research. So just keep an eye out for that Orcid icon and connect your Orcid ID wherever you possibly can, and it'll help save you time. And these slides will be shared, so you'll have these links, but we do have some additional resources that can kind of help you as you move forward with Orcid in the future. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Wei Ling.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for Sheila talking about all the details of Orcid. And so when you need help or have any questions about Orcid, I will be your contact person at UofL. And there are two ways you can contact me or find more information about Orcid. Next slide, please. Yeah, here is my email address, and we also have a website about Orcid. And if you want to go directly to the website, it's just library.louisville.edu/Orcid. Or if you go from the library's front page, you can also get from there. Just click on support for faculty. Next slide, please. Okay, here is my contact information, and also besides Orcid, I can also help you with some questions about remote access to the library's electronic resources. Next, please. And here is a screenshot of the website, the library's website. So if you click on support for faculty, you will go to the next page. And from this support for faculty, you look at the third column here under research and publishing support. We have a link there, Orcid and UofL Folio. So you follow that link, you will get to the LibGuide, library guides about Orcid. So the this site currently is focused on the 4 steps that that will walk you through from getting an Orcid ID, and then how you add works into Orcid, and how you export works, and how to import works into your Folio. So next page. Yeah, this is the second one. And then there are some tabs with more information about those subtopics. So next, please. And yeah, this one is so far, because the there's some issue with UofL Folio integration with Orcid. So right now, the best way to do is using the Bib Text. So you export your citation information from Orcid and then do the import in your Folio. Next, please. And yeah, this last step is how you put in words you export it from Orcid into your Folio. And then the last page will be the contact information and also frequently asked questions, and any other resources that we have will be added to here. I think that will be what I would say about the page. Thank you.
So at this time, I think we are ready to take any questions that people have. I have not seen any questions come through the chat, but if you do have a question, feel free to send it over to me in the chat. All right, I'm seeing a few questions come in. The first one is, can you use Folio to copy into an Orcid account? Wei-Ling, that might be a question for you. So if somebody has works in Folio, can they export the Bib Text to then upload that into Orcid?
If they can export it out, then yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so different systems are basically, some systems are not set up to work with Orcid yet at all. The Folio system at UofL right now is mostly just a one-way import. But if you go into your Folio account and there is an option to export it to Bib Text, or for example, if you're in Google Scholar or another platform that lets you export your works to a Bib Text file, you can certainly upload that to Orcid to get your works populated that way. A question about how will the link to the recording be distributed? Well, we're definitely going to send the link out to everyone who registered via email, but then Wei-Ling, are you going to make it available online?
Yeah,
as well?
I will.
Okay.
I will add it to the website.
Okay, perfect. And then there's a question from somebody who could not locate their publication in JRI. Could you help locate that? Yes, if you were looking for your specific publication in that Crossref metadata search, for example, we can certainly help you find that publication. Sometimes it is a little tricky. I will put into the chat. Of course, you can always contact Wei-Ling for questions. I'm also happy for you to contact me directly as well. If you're trying to get stuff into your Orcid record and you're having trouble finding it, you can contact either one of us and we can help you. Any other questions out there? Oops. I meant to put this in the chat to everyone. And I will say, there is a lot of documentation on the Orcid website for how to do certain things, but it can be a little overwhelming when you're trying to find information. So contacting myself or Wei-Ling will be able to, you know, help get what you need a lot faster. Any other last minute questions? Okay, well, I'm not seeing any other questions come through. But you do all have our email addresses. So if more questions do come up later, don't hesitate to contact us. And also just stay tuned for the link to the recording. And thanks again, everyone, so much for joining us today. Bailey or Wei-Ling, did you have any last comments?
No.
You first, Wei-Ling.
Oh, yeah, I don't have any more to add.
Same here, nothing to add, but thank you, Sheila. Really appreciate your time.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I hope this session was helpful. Thanks everyone for attending and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.